chance to pick a couple songs tonight. Would you like to pick a couple songs? Ready to go? That's a question. I'm the teacher. I'm giving you grades. Right now, you're all in an F.
279.
What is it?
279.
279. Somebody say today, if they get their hand in the air, put your hand in the air and then you'll figure it out. Okay. 299. Nine, nine. Oh, Randy, you had your hand up simultaneously. You don't know what, do you have a name?
402.
402. You and Robin had your hand up exact same time.
All right. Unless he wants me to stay in one place. So, all right. Well, good evening. It is good to see everyone. Good to have everyone here. Um, uh, in way of announcements, um, we have Lord's Supper coming up here in a couple Sundays, so remember that in the afternoon service. And then we've got Ladies Retreat end of October, and then we also have the game night October 31st. So start inviting and letting people know. So, any other announcements? Okay. All right. If there aren't any others, let's open up with the word prayer and we'll get going into our lesson. Brother Corey, would you lead the word prayer?
Lord, we thank you for this day and just for everything that you have blessed us with. And we just pray that you will just continue to guide us and help us that we can have an understanding and a thoughtfulness around your word as it is presented, that we will take it to heart, and just pray that you will just continue to guide us as a church, and that we will be in your will. And we do pray that you will be with the many requests, that you know every need, and that you would be in each of those situations with your hand of comfort and strength, and also your hand of wisdom as we interact with each other, that we might be uplifting and edifying. Show your love towards one another and to the world. And these things we ask in your name. Amen.
All right. So Annie had some outlines for those that would like to take notes. Let her know and she can give those to you. We're going to continue in Romans, the 12th chapter, just to kind of give everyone a head. We've already kind of talked on this. Ephesians 4:22 through 24, putting off concerning the former conversation, the old man, which is corrupt according to the deceitful lust, and be renewed in the spirit of your mind, that you put on the new man, which after God is created in righteousness and true holiness. We've been talking about how do we change. Now, the reason I'm going through this really quickly is I have a lot of information I want to share, a lot of things I want to talk about this. Hopefully I can get done this afternoon or this evening. So we've been talking about how do we change and become a new person or a new creature. And as we have talked about that, we've considered the putting on some things as we want to look like Christ. We want to portray Christ through the actions and the things that we do. We also want to think like Christ, because if we think like him, then we're going to start looking like him more. Then claiming some things, we looked at those promises and how that we can claim those to where we can be spiritually mature in Jesus Christ. Now, as we do all three of these things, one of the things that we have been looking at in Romans chapter 12 is we need to let Christ do something within us. And so as we look at that, we've been considering Romans 12, verses 1 through 3. It tells us there, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your body as a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Now, as we look at those two verses, just those two verses alone, we see what God is, God's request for us. We see that God has given us something that is reasonable for us to do. As we do that reasonable service, and as we are willing to give ourselves as a living sacrifice, our whole life, everything about us, presenting it, not taking it back. That's the idea of that present or present. We're giving him total control, total access. We're giving him everything about us to where he can be that, so that we can be holy and acceptable unto God. And he will do that when we, and he will start doing some things and transforming us. He wants us to not be conformed to this world, but how do we not be conformed? We need to do it by being transformed by the renewing. Remember, how many remember what I said renewing means? Renovate. Okay? So as we renovate, we want Christ to come in, clear out all of the bad, and clear out all the stuff that is from the old, and put in something new. And we want him to be what is new. And as I was putting this together, one of the things, what are we wanting him to create within our mind? Ultimately, what should be our ultimate goal to let Christ create within our mind? What's that? Trying to serve, okay? How about a place for him to dwell? Because if we want him to transform us, if we want him to renovate or renew our mind, how about a place where he can be all the time? You know? So as we think about that, keep that in mind, because when we allow him, because he's already dwelled and he's already living within us through the Holy Spirit, in that Spirit, if we allow him to renovate our mind, then we're going to let him live there. And if we allow him to live there, how much are we going to allow Satan to and this flesh move us? He's going to have a hard time. This flesh is going to have a hard time, okay? So we want to renovate, let Christ have a place to live, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. He will, when we allow him to work in our lives, we will be able to live that good life. We're going to be acceptable, and we're going to be mature, and we're going to be following the will of God. As we allow him to change our mind and allow him to do those things in our heart, okay? Or allow him to change our mind to be what he wants, okay? All right. Now, verse 3. Let's go to verse 3. It says, "For I say, through the grace given unto me, to every man that is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, according as God hath dealt to every man the measure of faith." Okay. Now, before we get into the bottom part, I want to kind of talk a little bit about that top and get into that second part. First of all, he says, "For I say, through the grace given unto me." Now, Paul is writing, we know that he is writing the book of Romans, and as he writes this, he says, "Through the grace given unto me." Now, when we think of grace, what is our first, when we think of a definition of grace, what do we think of? What's your first thought when you hear the word grace? What's your definition for grace?
Unmerited favor.
Unmerited favor, okay? Anyone else? Okay? That's the definition we typically go to, right? Okay? Now, if we want, he says that we can grow in grace, right? And we'll talk a little bit about this. But he says, as we know, it says, through the grace given unto me, God is going to give us grace. God is going to give us the things that as we allow Christ to change our mind from the inside out, what is going to happen? The word grace is an interesting word. The word actually has the idea, or the Greek word has the idea of acceptable, benefit, favor, gift, grace, joy, liberality.
Liberality.
There, thank you. Pleasure or thanks. Okay, those are other words that are used in the New Testament for the word grace. Now, if we use the definition as favor, if we, through the favor of God, God is giving unto us, he's given us everything we need to where we can accomplish his will, right? We've already looked at many things. We've looked at the promises that we can claim. We've looked at the what we are to think on. We've looked at what we are to put on. We look at all those things and we consider everything that the Bible tells us. He says, you have everything you need to do and be able to follow my will. Now, does he put any stipulations on that?
Here?
Here, sure. How about here? Not really. He's going to give you the grace that you need. We just got to do what he asks, right? We got to, let's go back to what he says. And be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. He just asks us to allow him to work in our life. Because, so think about it from this standpoint. If we allow Christ to change our mind, if we allow Christ to renovate and change our mind to where we are serving, to where all we think about is Jesus Christ, how much happier do you think we're going to be? A lot more happier, aren't we? How much joy are we going to have? Are we going to be focused on the negative all the time? Probably not. We'll see negative, but we're not going to be as focused on it. When you start thinking about all the things that would happen in us giving and us allowing Christ to change our mind, we're going to find that we're going to be so thankful for the things he has given us. We're going to be in his favor. We're going to be exemplifying him. We're going to be showing. Not only are we going to be not only are we going to be I don't know where it's going. But here's where I want to go. Is grace something that you can touch and feel? Not really. Okay? We talk about that we can grow in grace. Grace is given to us, right? So it's not something that you can, it's not tangible, right? It's not like this where I can touch it and feel it and it's like, here's grace, right? Grace is kind of a attitude, right? A mindset. And so if we think about it from that standpoint, it changes the thought of what verse 2 then means, right? Because 2 is really focused on our mind and how we are letting it work. Now, if it's something in our mind and how we can grow in grace in our mind and in that thought, think about this thought. To every man that is among you. So God is going to give us the grace that we need. Paul's saying he's giving me the grace. He will give you the grace. He will give you the favor. He will give you the gifts, the things that you need to accomplish his will. Okay? So now, let's go to the next part. It says not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think. Okay? First thing I want to point out. Of himself is not in the original text. Okay? It actually reads, not to think more highly than he ought to think. Okay? Now, I'm going to put a disclaimer out here right now. Okay? Did she try to talk to me? So my disclaimer is this. I'm not preaching at any one person. Okay, when I go into what we're going to talk about, one of the things of the information that I have gotten, that I started looking at, it hit home really hard. Okay, and so I want to share some of the things that as I'm looking at this, it really made me start thinking about how I act and how I deal with this. Okay, now when you get the idea of not to think of himself or not to think more highly than he ought to think. What's a term of someone that we think of that, or that you can think of that has that type of attitude?
You mean the holier than thou?
Okay. Holier than thou is what she said. Okay. We've all heard that terminology, right? Okay. Now, one of the things things that I want to touch on is the thought of this idea of holier than thou, because the idea that he's trying to portray is that we think that we're better, or that we have this, that we have, it says not to think of, think higher or more highly than you ought to think. We can fall into that trap, can't we? All of us can, right? Okay? We can have this idea that we are holier than thou. Now, many of you probably are going to ask, well, what's that attitude look like? Well, here's a general, kind of brief definition. It says, the attitude is a mindset characterized by an inflated sense of superiority and a self-righteousness. Individuals with this attitude often believe that their moral compass, beliefs, or lifestyle are superior to those of others, and they aren't shy about expressing these convictions. Okay? Now, before we kind of get into the weeds on this, can we point out anyone in the Bible that may have had this attitude?
Pharisee.
Pharisees is easy, okay? They were one of the first ones I thought. Okay? Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, all of them, okay? Anyone else?
Peter at some points.
Peter, okay? Kind of,
I don't really want to go to the Gentiles, you know, they're
Okay.
not worthy of me. You
Okay.
know, had to give them the cheap presentation and
right? Okay, okay. Peter, anyone else? How about Jonah?
Yeah.
You never think of it that way, but really, he kind of had that attitude, didn't he? He's like, Lord, they're not going to listen to you, so why should I waste my time? Essentially is what he's saying, right? He said, so he's already pre-decided that they weren't going to listen to him, and so they are, so he made that decision. How about King Solomon? How many wives did he have? Okay. Now, he learned from the best, right? David had that same struggle. But you think about it, they thought they were kind of above the law there in some ways. You know, God's intention was always to have one man and one woman from the very beginning. Now, I get that there were some things about culture and stuff like that, but I struggle with that being part of God's plan, because it really messed up his life. It messed up his family. It really messed up David's family and how that he dealt with it. So, you know, in some ways he dealt, you know, he had this kind of attitude that, you know, I'm above the law because I'm the king. Okay? Saul kind of had that attitude. You know, and so, you know, one of the things about this attitude that when we start looking at it, it's easy to see it in other people, isn't it? Right? No one wants to admit that. But many times we are quick to talk about the thought of people that think that they're better than others, or have this holier than thou attitude. But one of the things I want you to think about, I think we all have it at sometimes in our life. I think all of us deal with this, and we all can fall into this trap. Now, a Bible story. I think all of us probably can think of one Bible story that really portrays this attitude of holier than thou. Anyone have an idea what I'm thinking of?
Pharisee and the publican.
Exactly. Okay? So Luke 18, 9 through 14. We have the story of the Pharisee and the tax collector, or the publican. Okay? Now, if you want to turn there, or I've got the verses up, I want to read a couple of things as we on this story. Starting in verse 9, it says, "And he spake this parable." This is Jesus talking, and he said, "Unto a certain which trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others." He kind of describes the attitude, right? Okay. So he goes on to say, "Two men went up into the temple to pray, the one a Pharisee and the other a publican." Okay. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, "God, I thank thee that I am not as other men," kind of puffed up, says, "extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this publican. I fast twice in the week, I give tithes to all that I possess." And the publican, standing afar off, would not lift up so much as his eyes unto heaven, but smote upon his breast, saying, "God be merciful to me, a sinner." I tell you, this man, talking of the publican, went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone that exalteth himself shall be abased, and he that humbleth himself shall be exalted. Okay? Now, when we look at this story, we look at these two men and we see the difference. We see an individual with an attitude that he had a better, superior lifestyle. He was righteous in his own self, and he felt that he was better than the publican. He even points out, "I'm better than this publican," but we find that there's some humility in the other one. Okay, and we're going to talk about that word humble here in a few minutes. But he hypes himself up, and he shares how that he's closer to God than this other person. Okay? Now, one of the things as I was studying for this, I came across an article that kind of led me to some verses and some thoughts that as I was looking at them, it was like for me, it was like, I need to be careful of some things, okay? Because what we may think is just a standard statement, some could take as, "I'm being holier than thou." Okay? And so we need to be careful. And so what I did, so there's 5 things that I want to talk about. There's 5 warning signs of a holier than thou attitude that I want to talk a little bit about. And we'll talk about this in relationship to Jesus and what he portrayed. Okay? So one of the first ones. The first one is you feel you have to save someone or someone or everyone. Okay? What's the idea behind this? Well, the idea is that we as children of God have this, we should have a desire to want to help those around us, right? The Bible teaches that. We're to love our neighbors, we should help them, and we should want to be there to be kind and show that, and help those that need it. However, sometimes people, us, feel they have to help others in view of others or put it on a showcase, right? We got to make sure people know that we're helping other people, okay? Having this attitude that, and even if and helping people that don't necessarily even need our help, we want to make it to where so we feel like we have to be the ones that go out there and save everything, okay? The belief, that sometimes that people may have is that they aren't capable of helping themselves, or that only we can do what the one person that needs help can help them because of our abilities or knowledge or expertise. Okay, we think that we've got all the answers, and so we're the only one that can help them. Okay, so that's the idea. The thing that we need to be careful of, though, is if we are only helping someone to make the person or your peers see you as worthy of applause or accolades, are we really being a child of God or reflecting Jesus Christ? Not really. Because doesn't Jesus kind of talk about that? You go and you pray in the middle of the streets. What does he say? You've already received your reward, right? And so we need to be careful of that, okay? One of the things we want to be aware of is that sorry, I'm trying to read my notes. One of the things that we want to be aware of is that when we offer help to someone, that we don't want to make it a spectacle, okay? We want to help, what would happen if you went to someone and spoke to them in private and just said, hey, if you need some help, let me know, okay? Not forcing ourselves on other people, not trying to say that we have the answers for everything. Because when we go to them in private, it's between us and them, and it's also between us and God. Now, let me give you an example. Let's talk a little bit about an example. When Jesus would go into the cities, would he force himself on people?
No.
No. Did he always go straight to the outside of the gate to find the lepers and those that were outcasts? Did he go straight to them? In fact, what we find with Jesus is people would come to him, right? People would come to him and seek advice. Now, as he would speak to them, as he would talk to them, what we find is that he would listen to them, listen to what they had to say, and then say, okay, here's what I can do to help you. What I find interesting with Jesus, when you go and you start looking at the scriptures and you look at the gospels and you see how he dealt with people, he asked more questions than he did anything else. And so as he asked the questions, he would seek out, okay, what are you looking for? What are you wanting? Think of Nicodemus. Nicodemus, very wise man who knew the scriptures and knew all this, and he comes to Jesus at night and he says, we know you're a great teacher. We see all of this, okay? And Nicodemus goes on and says, help me understand. And as he explains it, what's Jesus' response?
You must be born again.
You must be born again. Right? He doesn't force it on him. He just says, hey, Nicodemus, you want to understand what's going on? You want to understand me? You got to be born again. And then he explains that thought, and he lets Nicodemus ask questions, and he listens to those questions. And so as he listens to those questions, he then answers those and addresses those questions to that person. Okay? Now, is it our job to save everybody? In fact, we can't. There's only one person that can, and it's Jesus Christ. And what we really need to do is point people to Jesus Christ. You know who is the greatest physician? Jesus Christ. You know who's the greatest comforter? Jesus Christ. And so, as you think about this, understand that, and this is one of those things that I was thinking about, there's times where people are hurting and I want to go and help them and I want to be able to, I want to build, because men, we're fixers, right? Right? We like to fix things, okay? If it's broken, we're going to try to find the part and get it fixed so it can get back to where it needs to be so it can do the job it's supposed to do, right? This, sometimes we can't fix. What we have to do is point them to Jesus Christ. He can fix it. Yeah? And so we have to be careful with that just because they're coming with us with problems, we need to point them to Jesus Christ. Not point him to my thoughts, what I think, but point him to what God's word says and show him how he can comfort them. Okay? Anyone have any thoughts or comments? Anything anyone wants to add? Okay. All right, let's go to the second one. Comparing yourself to others and that you wouldn't do this or that. Okay? Have you ever said, I would never? Never seen that? Never done it?
No, he said never say never.
Never say never, okay? You know, you think about thought. This is really a classic example of this attitude, okay? Because I think many of us can attest that we've all had problems, we've all had things that have gone on in our life. And then there's that one person that comes in and he says, well, I would have never. And you're going, well, you've never experienced what I've gone through, right? Right? That's what our first thought is, right? You know, and really, and one of the things that's interesting is a lot of children of God make that statement sometimes, right? Well, I would have never, right? About that sinner over there or that person over there, or, you know, and we make these comments, and really, and this was one that really kind of hit me because I never thought of it coming across that way, but put yourself in the position of the person that's hearing that, or you hearing that, and what are you're gonna think? You think you're better than me because you have better you just because you've gone through something similar than that? No. That's the thing we need to understand, that yes, there's nothing new under the sun. Yes, that Christ says we're all going to deal with tribulations, we're all going to deal with struggles. But one of the things that we need to be careful of is that we don't fall into that we don't get caught up in the same temptation. Because can we fall into the same temptation or trial or sin that they fell into? Absolutely. And then they're going to go, well, I would have never. But we got to be careful with that, right? Because there is absolutely nothing stopping us from going into the same trial or temptation that other person could have gone through. And then, what are we going to do? You know, we need to be careful with that. When we think about this, think about the woman at the well. Woman at the well comes and asks, and she's a sinner, right? Numerous husbands, right? Jesus calls her out on the husbands, right? And as he calls her out, does he ever say, well, I would have never done that? No. In fact, he meets her and he talks to her a little bit, and he goes on to talk about worship. She goes, well, you Jews, I know, going back to that a little bit, but you Jews think you have to only worship in Jerusalem, and we say you can worship in these mountains. And even that, Jesus doesn't bite. What he says is, you know what? None of that really matters. What matters is there's coming a time where we're going to need to worship in spirit and truth. And it's not going to be in this mountain or in Jerusalem. It's going to come a time where it's going to be done through his church. We're going to worship him in spirit and truth. You know, you think about his approach, and you look at how he handled that whole situation. He could have very well said, well, I never, but he didn't. And he gives us that perfect example of how to deal with people, not comparing ourselves to other people. Now, we can look at other individuals and we can see how they did compare themselves. But we find that Jesus, and I'm trying to use Jesus as an example of all of these, where Jesus listened and he tried to not compare himself to other people, but to point them to the one that is the true example, being Jesus Christ. Okay? Any thoughts or comments? Yes.
I was just thinking about, if you're talking to somebody who is struggling with a sin and you innocently say, I have never, even that's not as critical as I would never do that.
Right.
But just even saying I've never done that, that can still be discouraging to them because then they immediately feel like, well, I'm wrong because I have. Right?
Right.
And sometimes then that makes it harder for them to overcome that sin,
Right.
because now they feel guilty, right? There's that addition. And granted, we should feel guilty for our sin, right? But we don't need to help,
We're
right?
not the ones that's trying to do the convicting.
Right.
We want Christ to do the convicting, right? Okay.
Sometimes you shouldn't say anything at all. At all.
Very good point. Okay. Anyone else? Yeah. All right. Let's go to the third one. Feel you have to follow certain criteria for being obsessive about the law or laws. Okay. Now, this was one of those that I was like, what? But as I read through this and I started thinking, I was like, well, yeah, I can see this, because it's really a twofold warning. Okay, we as children of God can sometimes can fall back into the law, right? The letter of the law, right? Where we have this list of things that we are to hold to, and that if we don't hold to them, then some idea is we're not worthy. The thing is, are any of us really worthy?
No.
We're not. We're all sinners. What's interesting though is it takes the thought of this person as he was writing this, is it actually can go into the thought of even other criteria. There are some things that I can be a little obsessive about. Okay? But here's something I want you to think about. Has anyone, and I'm not gonna, I think I know the answer. Has anyone ever gone 1 mile over the speed limit?
Oh, it's no.
I have never.
You know how hard that is? It's much easier to go 5 over.
Go under.
Okay? But
You should raise
there's
your
a
hand. Andy
listed.
has not.
I go under.
So think about that. What does the Bible say? If you break one law, you broke them all, right? So think about it. So we can get hung up on things that are really not that important, right? We can get hung up on these things, these criteria and these things that. Now, one of the things, my wife has a job that she is very black and white because of her job, because of there's certain laws, there's certain things that she needs to follow to make sure, and that she needs to follow to make sure that the company that she works for is doing what they're supposed to be doing. Okay? Now, is that being holier than thou? No, I don't think it is. I think there's a little bit of a difference. Okay? She's following guidelines and things that she needs to. Okay? What I find interesting is that I want to consider a thought. The scribes came to Jesus in Matthew 12, 28 through 31. They come to Jesus and they ask him a question. Which command is greater than the others? Right? Okay? Jesus, now, what's interesting, I was studying this and I found this interesting. When our first thought of the law is what?
Ten Commandments.
10 Commandments, right? 10 Commandments, okay? One of the things I found interesting is that at this moment of time when the scribes were coming to this, not only did they have the 10 Commandments, they had an additional like 150 added commands to explain those 10 that they felt were important to hold to in relationship to the Jews and all this stuff, okay? You know, now, when Jesus addresses them, he doesn't address the 100 and whatever that they have added. He addresses really the first 10. Because he says, here, all of the law is summed up into these two, right? Everything. Everything is summed up into these two. Love the Lord with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind. Love thy neighbor as thyself. Everything falls under those two. Huh. So why are they obsessing about all these other things? One of the things I think for us as human beings, not just children of God, but human beings, we like lists. So that way when we look at people, we can say, oh, you broke that one. Right? No one wants to answer. But we are. By nature, we can be that way. We look at it, we go, oh, they broke the, oh, they lied. Check mark, you broke the law. Right? And then we go, well, I never lied. Well, you just lied. Right? And so we compare ourselves between those, what we have put down on this, our imaginary piece of paper as these laws, and as someone, we can go, well, here's mine, here's theirs. I'm doing pretty good. But really, if we were honest with ourselves, we've got some black marks on our paper too. We're not as perfect as we think we are, okay? So keep that in mind as you go through. That our ultimate goal, God makes it very easy. He says, love me with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul. Love thy neighbor as thyself. Everything's summed up under that. And if we love our neighbor, we're not going to look down on them. And kind of one of the things we're going to talk about. But we're going to want to point them to Jesus Christ, okay? Anyone have any comments or anything you want to add? Okay. All right. Fourth one. Believe you could be or are your own Jesus. Now, this one, a whole religion is surrounded around. Okay. And I don't believe this one. This is one of those I can definitely say I don't do. So essentially the idea is that I can pray and I can talk to God enough that I can change his mind to answer my prayer however I want. Okay? So there's a whole religion surrounding this thought where people will not do medication because if they pray hard enough and they pray long enough, then God will heal that child or person. And there's been a lot of things, not recently, but there was a lot of news reports about a religion that would surrounded around this thought. Okay? Now, God, one of the things, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one because it's ridiculous. But the thought is that if I pray hard enough, that God can heal me of cancer.
He can.
He can, but if it's God's plan for you to have it, you're going to have it. You're not going to change God's mind. God's mind is holy. God has, I get that we can look back and say, and there's an argument that some people change God's mind in the Bible. I think God knew he was planning on some of those things. Now, some would say that, who was it? Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham kind of changed his mind on the amount of people. I don't think he changed his mind. He had already decided, and he knew there wasn't gonna be 10 people in there, okay? So there's a lot of things that you look at that, and yeah, so I struggle with that. That's one of the things with this, is I believe God has a plan for everyone, and that plan will be for our betterment and growth, regardless of where we're at, or where we want certain blessings or not. Okay? Yes, sir.
Not sure I followed you on that.
Okay.
I completely agree that you can't be your own Jesus. Jesus
Okay.
is the only Jesus.
Right.
But if I get cancer, should I not pray for it or pray for God to change it?
No, I'm not saying you shouldn't pray for it, but to pray. So there is a religion that has this thought that, so essentially, so here's what I know. So there was a family that had a child who ended up getting sick. The child was sick. They put that child on oxygen, on machines, and to keep it alive. The doctor said he was brain dead. The pastor of that church said, well, you need to pray harder. And you need to pray more. And so they started calling all these people and all these people in this church together and saying, we're going to pray till God answers your prayer. Well, then what happened is that child ended up dying. Well, that pastor ended up saying it's because you didn't pray hard enough. You didn't have the faith. That's where I'm going with that. Does that make sense?
I'm following you.
Okay. I'm not saying don't pray. That's not what I'm trying to say. And I'm not saying that at some point we need to understand that God has a plan, and accept the answer that no, that you can't. But also understand that it's not based on our lack of faith. It's based off it's God's plan. That God had a plan for this to happen, for whatever reason. I don't know. Does that make sense? Karen, you were gonna add?
Oh, sorry.
On this one, I was thinking about it. If you tone it back from the whole, I believe I know better than Jesus. Well, I guess we do, right? How often do we make a decision knowing it's not God's will and do it anyways, right? So aren't we in turn saying that we know better than God?
True.
And to an extent?
Right. Yeah.
Well,
Go ahead.
And I was gonna, you covered like the after effects to a degree of not accepting God's decision,
Right.
and belittling others for lack of faith when
Right.
things don't go the way that they wanted it.
Right.
You can look at, a couple of different examples come to mind, with the way David reacted. He was told the child would die. He prayed constantly to change that.
Right.
God said no. The effect happened. Child died. He got up, went on his way.
Right.
He quit.
Mm-hmm.
And accepted that decision and was okay with it. And then the other one was like Paul even said,
Right.
with the response of hey, I came 3 times to have this problem, whatever it was, removed.
Right.
And Paul had a lot of faith.
Right.
He was held up as a great example.
Right.
But even he couldn't have the problem removed because God was using it for his benefit.
Right. Right. So, and I think that's where we have to use some discernment, and I think that and I would absolutely agree. If I had cancer, I'm going to pray about it. I'm going to seek God heal it and try to heal it. So we're going to go over a little bit, but I want to just touch on this. Speaking of this one of the things, so my surgery, my hope was that I was going to get back to 100%. That's what I was praying for. And that's what I was desiring. And I was hoping I'd get the feeling in my legs and I would get to be able to go back to playing basketball with Annie and be able to do some of those things. I'm gonna be honest, I struggled with that for a little while. And it's just been within the last 6 months where I finally have decided, you know what? This is God's plan. No, it's gonna be hard. I don't have the use of my legs like I used to. I don't feel my legs. I don't feel my feet like I used to. But Rachel reminded me, I can still walk. And so I gotta look at it from the positive side and understand that this is maybe God's way of humbling me a little bit, and helping me to where I can grow in that grace and grow in that knowledge of Him, to where I can still do things. It's just I just can't do it like I used to, and so I've learned to not really live with it, but trust in God and know that He's going to take care of it. So I'll be honest, it took me a little while. I was ready to go to the doctors and start doing all this stuff to figure out what it was, and I just finally came to the realization within the last 6 months. It's not worth it. I'd rather be happy and just be happy and want to serve God and let Him work and trust in Him. Okay. Any other thoughts? Okay. All right. I want to look at this last one. I know it's 8, but bear with me. I don't think this will take very long. Okay. Number 5, being blinded to others' needs because of focus on self. What is essentially the gist of this is as someone has a need, our needs become more important than that other person's needs. Okay, to where we justify in our own mind that we can't help them because what we have to do is more important than what they have going on there. Okay, now as we have this thought, we need to be careful because God does tell us that we should take care of. We need to be willing to address those things that God has put on our mind. But many times we hear people and they have these needs, and we go, "Well, mine's more important. I need to deal with what I've got to deal with first." And I'll be honest, I find myself in this situation many times where people ask me for help, and I'm going, "Well, but I gotta think back, and I gotta understand or think about, is what I think I need to get done that important to help someone that may be lost?" Okay? And so think about that. Or help someone that really does have a need. Okay? Now, perfect example. I think this is the best example there is. Jesus on the cross. He's hanging there in pain, in agony. One says, "Hey, if you're Jesus, if you're the Son of God, get us down." You think Jesus was hurting? His flesh was in pain. He was having a hard time breathing. He was getting all of it. He listens to this one man, and then the other man on the other side says, "You know what? If you knew who this guy was, you'd know that we deserve to be here." And through all the pain, through all the torment, through all of the struggle, he could have just ignored all of it. But he took that one moment to put all of that aside and say to that one man, "Today thou shalt be with me in paradise." Talk about putting your needs before someone else's. He did that. He was willing to do that. And he did say, "You know what? Can't you guys see what I'm going through right here?" Right? I think that may have been something we might have said. "Can't you see I'm going through something right here? Don't you feel sorry for me?" But he felt more need for other people than us, or than anyone else than himself. But one of the things I want us to also understand is that sin is sin. There's not anyone's sin better or worse than the other. They're all the same. But Jesus also, God does not have a respecter of persons. He loves all of us the same. I'm thankful for that. I don't know about you. I'm thankful that he loves all of us the same. I'm thankful that he looks at all of us the same. The only difference between me and a lost person is the grace of God. That is the only difference. We're all still sinners, and we're all still working on trying to grow and mature. The only difference, and the other thing that I found interesting, I heard this as I was preparing all of this. You go back to Romans 12 and verse 3. One of the things that is going on in those lost people is their thinking, right? In their mind, they're right. And the only thing that's going to change their mind and change their thought pattern is Jesus Christ. And that's the thing as we look at the world today. I get it that there is a lot of turmoil. There is a lot of people who, and this attitude is not just in churches, it's in the world. Okay? It's in politics, it's in workplaces, it's everywhere. Okay? The main reason I wanted to share this with all of you is because for me, it was eye-opening. For me, it was an eye-opener looking and seeing that, you know what, I have some things I need to work on. And I hope for you it's something that you can go back and not look at other people, not look at how other people are acting, but go back and say, oh, there's some things I need to work on. There's some things that I need to deal with. And as we deal with that, understand, he tells us, here's the remedy for that thought pattern. He says, but to think soberly according as God hath dealt to every man a measure of faith. The idea behind that is that we are humble to the will of God. And to let Christ work in our heart and mind. Humbling ourselves is not falling down on our face and falling and just being, not getting beat up and all. That's not what it's talking about. The idea of humbleness is recognizing who we are in relationship to God. And understanding that we are who we are because of Jesus Christ. I am Jimmy Hubbard, and I'm here as the pastor of this church because of of Jesus Christ. Okay? It's because of what he's done. And if I'm not willing to humble myself, and as children of God, I get it. I've been there. I've done it. And I have to be careful of this. Many times we put ourselves on this pedestal. And as we put ourselves on this pedestal, we're looking and we look down on these other people and we're going, why can't you be like me? And all this stuff. And it's, who should be on the pedestal? Jesus. It's not, that pedestal is not made for us. That pedestal is made for him. And as we allow him to stand on that pedestal, as we allow him to be the God of our life and be the one that changes our mind and helps us to think soberly and to follow his will, I like this verse. But he giveth more grace. Again, we're talking about grace. We're talking about that joy, that excitement, that favor. He giveth more grace, wherefore he saith, God resisteth the proud, but giveth grace unto who?
Humble.
The humble. I can't stress this enough. The Bible teaches if we are willing to humble ourselves under the mighty hand of God, he will lift us up. It's not based off of my actions. It's not based off of my beliefs, my morals, my how long I've been in church. None of that matters. What matters is if I'm humbling myself and allowing Him to work and allowing Him to lift me up and allowing Him to give me the joy, fill my cup the way that He wants me to. Okay? Any final thoughts or comments? Thank you for your time. Thank you for allowing me to go over. Any prayer requests before we dismiss?